Maps.
Hello, good afternoon, and hi to all you folks in faraway Rhode Island. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I was going to be here virtually, but Rick Doblin arranged to get me a ride down from San Rafael and to get me a ride back to the San Francisco airport immediately at the end of my talk, so I'm happy to be here in person. Now, I should say at the beginning that I'm in some ways not the best person to give you any prognostications or thoughts about where things are going, because when I did human experiments with marijuana in 1968, I thought that marijuana would be legalized in 10 years. And I thought it was just a matter of getting truthful information out to people, because the laws and attitudes were based on such wrong assumptions about marijuana and about psychedelics. And I quickly learned that that's not the case. That in fact people believe what they want to believe and don't believe what they don't want to believe, despite what the facts are and what the evidence are. And I've seen the same thing again and again in my work in trying to change the medical paradigm and to try and change medical education. That there are many people that believe that the way to change things is by doing research and producing data. And I can tell you in medicine that's not the case. We even have very good data showing that doctors don't change their practices based on the results of randomized controlled trials. The Integrative Medicine Center that I founded and direct at the University of Arizona College of Medicine is now a center of excellence at the University of Arizona and the world leader in training physicians and other health professionals in a new model of medicine. I'll talk to you about that in a moment. And the reason we were able to do this was really the support of one man, Jim Dolan, who was the dean of the College of Medicine and was the first medical school dean to go out on a limb to support something of this kind. He retired a few years ago, and when he did, he said that his proudest accomplishment was the Integrative Medicine Center. And he also said that one of the things that he had learned, and I think this is a lesson for all of us, is that the way, he said this about doctors, he said the way doctors and medical scientists react to new information is more a function of its source than its content. That if information comes from an unfamiliar source, the instinctive reaction is one of defensiveness, exclusion, and reaction against it. And the example that he liked to use, which I think is very apt, is that the observation that aspirin was an anticoagulant and might be useful in preventing heart attacks was first made in the 1950s by a general practitioner in Southern California. This was the time when tonsillectomy was universal. You could not make it to adolescence with your tonsils and adenoids if you were in a middle-class family. And it was common practice to give kids aspargum to chew, a chewable form of aspirin. And this doctor noticed that the kids who chewed aspargum had more and longer bleeding in their throats than kids who didn't. So he thought maybe aspirin is a blood thinner, and he began taking it himself and noticed that when he cut himself shaving that the cuts bled longer. So he gave this to a number of his patients and satisfied himself that this was a reasonable hypothesis, which he published in a journal of general practice with the suggestion that aspirin might be useful as a preventive for heart attacks. It took 30 years for cardiologists to recognize the validity of that hypothesis and test it, and the reason was that it was proposed by a general practitioner, not by a cardiologist, and it was published in a journal that cardiologists don't think much of. Now that's within the realm of medicine. Imagine when information about these things comes from more distant and more foreign sources, like shamans in exotic cultures. And I think this is what we really have to understand, that the reason that the drugs that we're interested in provoke so much controversy, the reason that they have stimulated the kind of backlash that has thwarted research and thwarted clinical use, really this is fundamentally emotional and irrational. It is not based, it's not something that can be dealt with through argument, through scientific information. It's a matter of changing the culture and changing attitudes. The problem with marijuana is that it has still not outgrown its associations in this culture with outsiders, deviants, subcultures that are not considered part of the mainstream. It entered North American society through two routes: through black jazz musicians in the South, principally in New Orleans, through Mexican migrant workers that came in through the southern border. It then, in the 1950s, was associated with beatniks. Then in the 60s, with this vast counterculture that grew up. It is those associations of marijuana that cause mainstream America to react against it. And this continues to persist. I'm delighted to see that there is now opening in the world of psychedelic research. I mean, something clearly has changed there. It hasn't yet changed with marijuana. That's unfortunate. I'm very disappointed that our president has not done more to support the change in medical marijuana legislation. No, but we have an opening at the moment with psychedelics, which is both surprising, welcome. I think it's something that we want to work with, and I am very pleased to see the kinds of research that have been done. I also have to tell you that over the years, as I've looked at the potentials and dangers of psychedelic drugs and their possibilities for clinical applications, I've been somewhat puzzled by several things about it. First of all, in purely medical terms, these drugs, especially the indole psychedelics, are probably the least toxicity of any pharmacological agents that we know. As you know, you cannot. There have been no deaths reported with LSD directly caused by its pharmacological action, except in one elephant. I'm sure most of you know that horrible story. If not, you can look it up. The striking absence of toxicity of these agents, combined with their tremendous power to alter perception and the mind-body axis, certainly recommends them for research and clinical use. But I have to tell you that I've been puzzled, and by the way, I should say that the other category of psychedelics, the phenethylamines, have somewhat greater toxicity because of their adrenergic stimulant properties. That puts them in a somewhat different class, but still these are quite safe agents compared to most of the drugs that are routinely prescribed in medicine today. What puzzles me about the psychedelic research over the years, in contrast with my own experience with them, is that almost all of it has focused on psychological potentials. Initially with things like helping people with end-of-life issues, for example, or with PTSD. My interest has always been in what I would call the psychosomatic potential of these drugs. That is their potential to change bodily processes and physical disease as a result of taking advantage of that mind-body connection. So this goes back, let me just say a word about integrative medicine and the philosophy of medicine that I teach and have always practiced. In the popular mind, integrative medicine is the intelligent combination of conventional and alternative medicine, but really that's a very narrow definition of it. The much broader way of looking at integrative medicine, which I firmly believe represents the future of medicine and the solution to our healthcare crisis, is that it is working for some very big changes in the way in conventional medical thinking. The first is to restore the focus of medicine onto health and healing, and to acknowledge, respect, take advantage of the human organism's tremendous potential for self-diagnosis, self-regulation, regeneration, repair, adaptation. To me, that's the most wonderful feature of human biology, that our bodies have the ability to know when they have suffered injury or damage, to repair themselves. And this is not mystical, this is biology, and it's something you can observe at any level of biological organization from DNA on up. The DNA molecule, a huge macromolecule that's on the border between life and non-life, has the potential within it to know that when it has been injured by an ultraviolet ray, for example, and immediately to begin elaborating specific repair enzymes to repair the damage. And that same potential you can see whether you look at organelles, cells, tissues, organs, the whole organism. And that's where good medicine should start. The second broad principle of integrative medicine is our insistence that human beings are more than physical bodies. We're also mental, emotional beings, spiritual entities, community members. Those other dimensions of human life are incredibly relevant to understanding health and illness. If you cut them off and only look at the physical body, not only do you cut yourself off from an understanding of the real causes of health and illness, but you also limit your treatment interventions to those directed at the physical body, which are the ones that tend to be most expensive, most invasive, most productive of harm, and often quite limited in their ability to change physical conditions. A third principle of integrative medicine is that we pay attention to all aspects of lifestyle and understanding health and illness, and I think this is where integrative medicine really shines in its ability to deliver true preventive care and health promotion, something that's very relevant to the so-called healthcare debate that we've been living through. And also, integrative medicine places great emphasis on the practitioner-patient relationship, which has suffered horribly in the present era of for-profit medicine. Throughout history and in most cultures, that relationship has been recognized as special, even sacred. Something magical can happen when a medically trained person sits with a patient and simply allows that person to tell their story. That alone can initiate a healing response before any specific treatment suggestions are given. And also over the years, that has been the source of the greatest emotional reward of practicing medicine. And its complete undermining in the era of managed care and for-profit medicine is one reason why so many physicians today are unhappy and so many are leaving or have left the practice of medicine. And then finally, integrative medicine is willing to look at all therapeutic options out there, especially those that don't cause harm and show reasonable evidence of efficacy. And there's so much that's not even on the radar screen of conventional medicine that we can bring in. Among them, the targeted use of psychedelic therapy. Now, what has puzzled me in looking at this focus of psychedelic research on the psychological and the omission of the physical is that in my own experience, both in my personal life and in working with patients and in discussing this with a great many users of psychedelics, I have observed, seen, experienced, collected many individual case reports of quite spectacular healing reactions of serious diseases. And these healing reactions were catalyzed by a change in perception that was triggered by a psychedelic experience, sometimes deliberately by a therapist who guided the session in a certain direction, sometimes quite gratuitously. And I'll just give you a couple examples of what I mean. The first one that I'll give you is something that I have published. Some years ago, 60 Minutes did an in-depth piece on me, which was supposed to be friendly and wasn't. And I told the interviewer this story, which was incidental in 3 days of interviewing about integrative medicine. And they sent out a press release with this as the headline. This was the story that they used. So, and the story was, you know, Dr. Weil claims that LSD cured his cat allergies. All right. It did, and here's the story. I was very allergic as a kid in all sorts of ways. I had hay fever, I got hives in response to various drugs and things. You know, I was allergic for a lot of my life, and one of the allergies that I had was to cats. And whenever a cat got near me, I would tend to, my eyes would itch, my nose would run. If I touched the cat, this got much worse, and if a cat licked me, I got hives where it licked me. So I had in my mind a mindset that I was allergic to cats, and therefore I didn't want them in my presence. And if a cat came near me, I would either push it away or withdraw myself. So there was a deep ingrained defensiveness in my interactions with cats. One day when I was 28 and was making a lot of changes in my life, I took LSD with some friends. I was living in the countryside in Virginia. It was a beautiful spring day. I was in a terrific space. Everything was wonderful. You know, the world was magical. Everything was alive. And into this scene, a cat bounded. And and jumped in my lap. And I had a split second of the habitual reaction, and suddenly I decided this was silly. You know, why did I have to do this? So I started petting the cat. I began playing with the cat. The cat licked me. I had no reaction to the cat. I have never had a reaction to a cat since. And that was almost 40 years ago. Now that's pretty spectacular. You know, as a physician, I would love to know what happened there. And I'd love to know how to make that happen in other people. Anyway, I'll tell you one that's even more spectacular, which I haven't written about, and this was roughly in the same time period. Another mindset that I had grown up with all my life was that I had fair skin, and I couldn't get tan. And my experience, and I was always told this, you have fair skin. So whenever I went to the beach, my experience was, you know, a second-degree sunburn, completely red, and then going home putting Noxzema all over my body, and then sheets of skin would peel off several days later. That was how I reacted to the sun, and I had accepted in my mind, this is the way I react to the sun. So also in the same period when I was doing these experiments, I guess I was also 28, and this was also in Virginia, and it was another time that I took LSD, and it was in a wonderful space, and I was running around without any clothes on, and I was decided that, you know, it was such a nice day, I was going to lie out in the sun. And that I remember thinking, why should I think that the sun is my enemy? Why can't I simply, you know, enjoy the sun and be in it? I got tan instantly, and I have ever since. You know, I now live in southern Arizona. I've spent 30 years in the desert. I develop wonderful tans. I've never had sunburns like that. An instant change in a pattern that had lasted 28 years. That is pretty spectacular. How did that happen? You know, what's the mechanism of this? I don't think this is magic. You know, it's wonderful. But there has to be a physiological mechanism for that, which is a little more, in some ways, to me, a little more interesting and harder to understand than the disappearance of an allergic reaction. You know, allergies come and go, and I've always taught patients that allergies are learned reactions and that anything that's learned can be unlearned. And that, to me, is the most interesting thing about allergies. There's very interesting stuff in the mind-body literature about allergies. You can show a person who has a strong allergic reaction to roses a plastic rose, and they will have an allergic reaction. So I mean, that shows that the higher brain is involved in this process. And there may be many ways to produce these changes or to break that, but the potential for psychedelics to be used in this way are great. I could imagine, you know, in some era when psychedelics are available for medical use, maybe you could open an allergy clinic and you could have 10 structured sessions, and on the first session the person would take an ordinary dose of one of these things and be around the allergen, and then if necessary they could come back, and each time the dose would be cut down until for the last few sessions they aren't taking anything. I mean, the pill might look the same, and then you'd tell them that they weren't taking anything active and they could go about their business and not have the allergy anymore. Now, even extending this further, I have also collected over the years some very dramatic cases, and some that I have been personally involved with, of people with chronic autoimmune disorders, including especially rheumatoid arthritis, also lupus, also multiple sclerosis, in which the same kinds of things have happened, where there was a dramatic shift related to psychedelic experience, sometimes a single use, sometimes multiple use, in which the condition disappeared. It seems to me, I just can't imagine anything of greater interest, and it puzzles me that researchers have not looked at this aspect of psychedelics. And one thing that I think would be useful would be try to collect case reports of this kind. So one thing that I would ask you, and for you to ask your friends, if you know anyone that has had experiences of this sort, it would be very useful to send them, or to make people at MAPS, for example, aware of them, so that we could begin to collect this kind of information in a systematic fashion. And if we had a body of this kind of information, it might inspire researchers in this area to begin thinking how they might set up experiments to do this. That principle of integrative medicine that I talked about, that we are not just physical bodies, we're also mental, emotional beings and spiritual entities and community members, the meaning of that is that all disease, like all health, is a matter of all of these factors being involved. And in any medical condition, there is a possibility of using the mind-body connection, the emotional connection, to change a disease process for the better. We have lots of ways there are lots of potential interventions to do that. There's hypnosis, there's guided imagery, there are various forms of mindfulness meditation. There's a whole fascinating area of neuroscience that's just come into being with the result of being able to visualize living brains, and a lot of this has been inspired by the Dalai Lama and a new generation of neuroscientists who are looking at adept Tibetan meditators and showing actual changes in brain activity and then thinking how these can be taught to other people. I think I see this as a great horizon and frontier of medical research. I've always taught that all disease is psychosomatic, but the problem is that word is so loaded that when we talk about psychosomatic conditions, most people, especially patients, think that you're telling them that their diseases are unreal. And that's not what psychosomatic means. The word just means mind-body. I've suggested maybe we should use the word somatopsychic, which doesn't have the same connotation. But the fact is that's how it is, and that with many conditions, we totally neglect the possibility of trying to change things by manipulating the psychic compartment. The psychedelic drugs especially are incredible tools for doing so. Now, I think one of the great obstacles to psychedelic research in the past that complicated things is that, and as I'm sure all of you know, the experiences that people have with psychedelics are exquisitely dependent on non-pharmacological factors. They are dependent on people's expectations set and on the environment, in the broadest sense, the setting in which drugs are taken. The initial people who did research with psychedelics and showed very positive changes, like Stan Grof, like Walter Pahnke, these were people who understood from their own experiences the nature of these drugs, their dependence on set and setting, their belief system, and the way that they were able to structure the settings, the laboratory settings in which they did research, shaped experiences in a certain direction. Other researchers who did not have those experiences, who did not have that understanding, read the results of the research, tried to reproduce them, and didn't get the same results because they thought that the drugs were magic bullets, that the drug contained the experience and would automatically do the thing that was reported in the literature. And when the results didn't come back that way, they said, well, the drugs really aren't any good. So apart from all the moralistic stuff and all of the cultural irrationality that thwarted psychedelic research, I think this is in a way, an even greater stumbling block, because these drugs don't work in the way that the pharmacological agents that most researchers work with do. They are not. It is not the magic, the potential is not entirely in the pharmacological action, and that unless researchers understand this, the likelihood of producing the kinds of positive changes that will get more people interested and may lead to a cultural change about the potential benefits of these drugs, this is not going to be realized. Now, I want to say also some words about marijuana, which is a very different beast from psychedelics. This is not related chemically or pharmacologically to the psychedelics. It often travels with them and in the same company, but it's a completely different thing, and it has its own problems and difficulties. Cannabinoid chemistry is unique in nature. These substances are unlike really any other chemicals that we're familiar with. One of the things that sets them apart from most drugs, both medical and psychoactive that we know, is that they're fat soluble, not water soluble. That is a big problem. That means that these drugs are not absorbed and distributed in the body in ways that we're familiar with. It's not easy to predict their metabolic fate and their pathways around the body because of their fat solubility. Another problem with marijuana is that there is extreme variation in individual sensitivity to it and into individual reaction with it. And that is very confounding for people who are looking for predictable effects, for substances that produce predictable effects. On a practical level, in looking at what's happening with medical marijuana around the country, I think until there is a way of cleanly separating medical use from recreational use, that it is going to be very difficult to have the medical profession accept marijuana as a therapeutic agent. You know, the way that marijuana is currently being dispensed in California, the way that most medical marijuana is being used, there's a very fuzzy boundary between that and recreational use. Also, I cannot imagine many of my medical colleagues being comfortable with recommending a therapeutic agent that has to be consumed in the form of smoke to be inhaled. That just doesn't work. I would love to see a whole extract of cannabis that was available for medical use in a form that was more familiar to physicians and to pharmacists. As I'm sure you may know, there is such a form available in the UK called Sativex. This is a whole cannabis extract to be sprayed into the mouth or under the tongue as an oral spray. It looks like a medical preparation. It's packaged like a medical preparation. It would be accepted by a medical preparation. It is very annoying that it's not available here. And this would be a great thing for people working in the area of medical marijuana to concentrate on and to work to make it available here. I think that would go a long way to increasing acceptance of this agent. With marijuana also, the tremendous advantage of it and a reason for investigating its clinical potentials is its almost complete absence of toxicity. I mean, you cannot kill people with marijuana. I remember years ago seeing some experiments in cats, which if you could extrapolate to humans, would suggest that a lethal dose might be 1.5 pounds of marijuana consumed orally at one time. In pharmacology and in medicine, you calculate the safety of a drug with a quantity called the therapeutic ratio, which is the ratio of the dose that begins to produce toxic symptoms to the dose that you want. And for many drugs that we use in clinical practice, that ratio is not that high. 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 times the dose that's used to produce a therapeutic effect is enough to begin to cause toxicity. You cannot calculate the therapeutic ratio for marijuana. It's not calculable. So just for that reason alone, we should be looking for ways to use it, let alone the fact that throughout history there have been many people who have testified to benefits that they've received from using marijuana for various conditions. Personally, I think the frontier of cannabis research that to me is most exciting is the possibility at looking at these strange molecules, these cannabinoids, and especially looking at analogs of them that may be developed in the future that can be used both as tools in brain research for understanding how the brain receives and interprets information. Because to me, this is one of the most interesting things about cannabis, is how it changes perception, how it can make ordinary experiences appear novel, how it can change focus of attention. I can see great potential here in using these drugs as tools in mind-brain research. I think the other area that fascinates me is looking at these compounds or analogs of them yet to be developed for manipulating appetite and for manipulating pain perception. I think these are two areas in which the therapeutic potential of cannabis looks very powerful to me. The appetite stuff, I mean, there have been some efforts in this direction at the moment which are certainly not there yet. But this, as you know, this is probably the greatest public health crisis facing us in this day and age is the obesity epidemic that we're seeing. The root of this is the nature in which we've changed food. I was just on a panel yesterday with Dr. David Kessler, the former head of the FDA, who's written a book called The End of Overeating, and his main argument is that the foods that we have today are designed to activate the brain, and that we're helpless in the face of this. That food has been manipulated in ways that cause brain activation, and that this is what seems to give them such power over us. So I don't know, maybe we're doomed in this regard. I think there's certainly, this is an argument for totally banning advertising of these kinds of foods. But you know, another area of possible research is finding ways to increase the brain's defensiveness against that kind of reactive activation in response to the kinds of foods that are out there now. And there is, I think, a real potential in the cannabinoids to do something of that sort. And the other area is as I said, is the modulation of pain perception. There already is a great deal of interesting research showing that cannabis can enhance the effects of opioids, so that people with chronic pain may be able to take lower doses of opioids, which has great advantage because there are many side effects of the derivatives of opium that are not desirable, among them mental clouding, and to be able to find ways. I mean, chronic pain is such an enormous problem in clinical medicine today. It absorbs so many healthcare dollars. It is so frustrating to manage that any new tools that we can get in that area would be extremely welcome. And as I say, I think there is great potential with cannabis to do that. So I guess in summing up and looking back on all this, although I have not been actively involved in either psychedelic research or marijuana research for many years, I continue to be struck by the incredible positive potential of these agents, not just for manipulation of moods and emotional states, but for dealing with and changing very real, very severe chronic medical illness through changing the way that people interpret or perceive the symptoms of illness that they experience, and that by doing so free up or unlock or unblock the body's healing potential. I think the fact that we've got this opening at the moment is terrific. I think we should be careful in the way that we design experiments and the way that these experiments are publicized. But I think that looking at, when you're looking at conditions which are not responsive to other methods, which involve lots of people, which are very costly, which are causative of human suffering, that there is a great possibility now for getting support for doing this, and to begin to change the, this very, very outdated and unhelpful cultural perception that we've lived with for far too long. So thank you. I'm going to stop there, and I want to continue by letting you ask me some questions. I think the whole field of mind-body research and mind-body medicine is coming into its own in a way that it never has before. There's an awful lot of... Close it? Okay, great. Bye. That was very satisfying. I have a friend and colleague who's now in his 80s, who was a very eminent endocrinologist, who was one of the founders and main movers of the field of psychosomatic medicine in the 1950s and 1960s. And he said to me that, he looks back and wonders why that field never went anywhere. Now that there is all this, tremendous amount of research being done, what happened to the field of psychosomatic medicine? And I said to him, I think the time was wrong. It was ahead of its time, and things were not ready. The ground had not been laid for the acceptance of that. And I think that's all being, it has been completely swept aside by this new field of mind-body medicine, which is getting very strong support from the neurosciences. I think the ability to visualize living brains has done more to make studies of consciousness, studies of altered states of consciousness, valid, real than any amount of arguing about it. You know, now you can show that people in certain states of consciousness, that brain function is different, and you can find specific localities in brain where function is different. Even, you know, in an area that I've been most interested in placebo responses, there's a whole new more juice going into that, because there's been studies showing that in placebo responses there are particular areas of the brain that seem to mediate this. So I think we're on the threshold of a whole new era of mind-body studies, of which psychoneuroimmunology, psychoendocrinology, this is all a part of that. And I think again that there's a potential for the psychedelics to be welcomed as tools to facilitate that research.
Hey, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. I enjoyed it tremendously. And one thing, you were talking about pain and different ways to minimize the pain, physical pain. I've studied a lot about the mind-body connection, especially the spiritual aspects of it, and I've had tremendous results, you know, resolving spiritual issues and how it affects you physically, how I had a horrible pain, and I just did this meditation where you connect, it's ending the pain meditation, and you, at the end you connect with your higher self. And I could not believe the results, how just my neck pain that was horrendous got so much better. But basically the studies that I've been really interested in, it's a channel called, a guy called Lazarus, and I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Louis Hay, where basically Lazarus says that a lot of the different pains in different parts of the body, it's like coded messages from your higher consciousness that are there to teach you and to guide you in a certain direction where you need healing. So he talks about you know, regular doctors as opposed to alternative doctors, and he says that a lot of times alternative doctors essentially do the same thing. They just go after eliminating the symptom. And so I guess my question is, sorry, have you thought about the spiritual meaning of pain and actually resolving it, like you were saying in the beginning, how much it matters, resolving it through the mind rather than you know, looking for just purely physical resolution?
I have thought about that. There's a lot written about the spiritual meaning of pain and ways that people in chronic pain can learn to reinterpret it or listen to it or see what it has to teach them. Mindfulness-based stress reduction training has been proven very valuable in working with patients with chronic pain. But I again have to tell you, since I'm really into the somatopsychics of things, the experiences that most interest me are not just subjective perception, but changes in body reactions. So, and this is another experience, I think this one I also have written about, and this is with MDMA, that frequently I've had the experience of, in an MDMA state, of being totally relaxed, walking barefoot on sharp stones that would normally hurt. It doesn't hurt. Okay, that's part's easy for me to explain. But what's hard to explain is why there are no impressions on my foot. You know, normally there would be dents in my foot. There aren't in that state. So what's happening there? I mean, I can hypothesize about it. I think that when the mind leaves the body alone, that muscles can very precisely respond to things, so that if there's a point of a rock pressing there, the muscle right there could press back with exactly the force to neutralize it. That stuff really interests me. You know, I'm very interested in how you can change reactions to things like insect stings or you know, being hit by something or being burned, and not only is the pain changeable, but the body's reaction is changeable, and that's something that can be learned. And it seems to me that the commonality here is dropping some sort of defensive stance toward the universe. That is, that the act of defending oneself in some way leads to some sort of rigidity or freezing of body responses that causes injury or allows injury to occur. And that's the area that I'd love to see research on.
Dr. Weil, I'm always in love with what you have to say. I just have one question. How do we get the ball rolling on legitimizing psychedelics and treatment modalities for people with real pain and suffering? I mean, most of the knowledge has been there from the 70s, from the 60s. There has to be some kind of tipping point in society, some point in the structure where the power shifts a little bit. And I'm just wondering how we, as ants, worker ants, army ants, little people, what we can do to see a brighter day.
In some ways, as gloomy as things look out there in some ways, I think the energy of the 60s and the energy of that period really has diffused through the culture. And it is working its way. And it seems to me that in casual conversation today, when I interact with a wide variety of people, I talk in many different locations, I think those attitudes are changing now. I think that there is greater acceptance of this, and I think there are ways of, especially with this kind of just the little bit of reporting that I've seen around this conference, or the reporting that I've seen on the recent articles about therapeutic uses of psychedelics. There's a different tone to them than there was before. I see Rick nodding his head. I think that's true. So, I am optimistic. I think I don't know that we're at a tipping point, but I think we're moving in the direction of a tipping point.
Andrew, I used to know you years ago back in the days of the hemp rallies in front of the LA Federal Building. And in honor of Jack Herer's death yesterday, I wanted to ask you...
Yes, I just heard that he died yesterday morning.
Yeah, he died yesterday morning at 11 a.m. And in honor of that, I wanted to ask you your opinion of the Rick Simpson cancer treatment oil, as well as Dr. Robert Malamede's research on using THC for the reduction of tumor cells, as well as the protecting of healthy cells.
Actually, I did not mention that in the things that I talked about, the areas of promising research. I think the other great, interesting area with cannabinoids is the possibilities of both preventing and treating cancer. And that's something that's completely unexpected. That these are recent findings, and even protective against lung cancer and other serious forms of cancer, as well as, by the way, protection against dementia and memory loss. Who would have ever thought? But there it is, and so I think again these are novel, interesting, unexpected potentials of cannabinoids that certainly should be explored.
I want to thank you for your speech. You mentioned that psychedelics can have psychosomatic effects on real physical problems for the body, such as multiple sclerosis. And I was wondering if you could enumerate those psychedelics and explain a little bit more about how that has that kind of effect.
All I can tell you is at the moment I have case reports. These are people that I knew, that were patients of mine, people that I have met, heard from, in which I am satisfied of the validity of the reports, and this is something that should be studied. And with the autoimmune diseases, including multiple sclerosis, the agents that were used were variable. Typically they were LSD, I think was the most common, sometimes MDMA, sometimes mushrooms. Sometimes the change happened instantaneously, as with my cat allergy or the suntan thing. Sometimes it was a change that happened over a period of weeks or months, sometimes with repeated use of the agent. But it seems as if, I don't know the mechanism. I can only speculate about it. I think it has to do with I think the ways that the mind interacts with the body are infinite and complex and wonderful, and that there are common ways in which the habitual patterns of mind or habitual patterns of interpreting perceptions get in the way of that innate healing mechanism that I talked about at the beginning of the talk.
Hello, doctor. It's great to have you here. My question pertains more to, I feel like there's been so much focus on the healing aspect of these medicines, but very little to the preventative aspects of it, and also going beyond it, preventative, and also to a health optimization. And a lot of the people I know who are using psychedelics are yogis and movement specialists, who are some of the healthiest people I know. Are going to, like Albert Hoffman, for example, who lives over 100 and has attributed that to regular use of LSD.
That's probably something we should not be widely talking about at the time when we're trying to produce a cultural change. I think I agree with you. I think that's true. I think we all have seen that. We all know people who've used psychedelics that way. I think that many people that I know who've been involved in the psychedelic world certainly feel that way. I'm concerned about about advertising that widely. I think at the moment we should be concentrating more on the therapeutic potentials that I talked about. But I think that's tremendously interesting. I don't think this culture is yet ready to hear about health optimization through regular use of psychedelics.
What prompted your discovery of Wiley?
What
prompted your discovery of Wiley? Psilocybin Wiley?
I did not discover psilocybe Wiley. It was discovered by a man in Georgia, and the mushroom was named for me by my friend Paul Stamets. So you aren't supposed to you don't name things for yourself in science, and I was very delighted by that, and but I had nothing to do with its discovery. So. But I'm very happy. By the way, I don't know whether you know that the word psilocybe in Greek, it means bald head. So that seems that seems appropriate.
Dr. Weil, I read an article, I believe it may have been in Psychopharmacology sometime in the past 12 months, which was concerning the existence of a polymorphism for the protein which produces monoamine oxidase. And stated briefly, there are two forms of MAO, one of which is more active than the other. Individuals who have the less active form are significantly more susceptible to the placebo effect. Mm-hmm. And what I'm wondering is whether the use of monoamine oxidase inhibition, obviously in ayahuasca, is in some way modulating one's susceptibility to the placebo effect.
I'm not familiar with that research. I will look it up. That's interesting. And if so, that's certainly what you say is certainly a possibility. Very interesting. I am a great believer in biochemical individuality. I think that's something that's often absolutely ignored in conventional pharmacotherapeutics, and something that people that use drugs, people who dispense drugs to others should be very aware of. There's wide range in reaction, some of which is based on differential ability to metabolize pharmacological agents. It's a very interesting idea. I'll check it out.
Okay. Doctor, this question comes from a little bit of personal experience. Are you aware of any studies regarding the use of tryptamine psychedelics, or even by extent cannabinoids, and the causing of physical pain in certain people who take these compounds?
Acutely at the time that they take them, or over time?
During a session. For example, the personal experience I had was I took LSD, and this was a few months after a joint surgery, and I sort of had that same feeling of pain that my shoulder was dislocating.
Huh.
And even though, according to my ortho doctor, it's completely stable, but I still had that same exact pain sensation of it sliding out of its socket, and it never actually happened.
I have seen occasional people who have experiences like that. I'm not sure how I would interpret them. I don't know whether that's just that you became aware of a body memory. And I think one of the potentials of psychedelics is to help people bring into consciousness memories, often painful memories that have been stored in the musculature of the body. So that's a possibility. Okay.
So my question comes from secondhand experience, and it's about friends who are suffering from prolonged persistent state of disorder of hallucinations. Mm-hmm. I've read that the best treatment that is known of is reassuring the person, because it can go away, but they think they're still experiencing it, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. Are there any new developments in that besides antipsychosis drugs?
I'm really not the person to ask about that, but if you're talking about the general category of flashbacks, I think the less attention paid to it, the better, and that they tend to go away. I think these are normal experiences that people have. If the drug experience was associated with anxiety, that having a memory of it can trigger anxiety. And then if you hear that this indicates brain damage, you can imagine that being a vicious cycle of anxiety. So I've always dealt with that by just reassuring people that these are not significant and will go away on their own.
Thanks very much for your enthusiasm and your calmness, and I think part of the calmness is you sound sort of apolitical, but I invite you for a minute to consider the politics, let's say, of the possibility in California of legalization of marijuana. It almost is, maybe partly because of the taxation issue, it's almost like this could be a possibility, and we might have legalized marijuana here before we have legal gay and lesbian marriages or single-payer health care, amazingly enough.
Amazing. I have not been apolitical in my writings or speaking, and those of you who know my book From Chocolate to Morphine, the first sentence of that book is that wars against drugs are always lost, and the strong argument of it is that the criminal law is not an effective or appropriate way to try to influence people's consumption of psychoactive drugs. That's the bottom line, and we have to how we get ourselves away from that, I don't know. I mean, I think that there has to be a commitment to back away from dependence on the criminal law as the method of dealing with this. And that whole superstructure of law has to be dismantled, and I would imagine it has to be done in a piecemeal fashion over time, and starting with the decriminalization of marijuana or legalization of it in appropriate amounts and finding other ways to regulate it, and eventually extending that to all other substances. I mean, it doesn't work. It creates immense damage. And another change that's happening in the world today, may be correlated with this opening that we're seeing with psychedelic research, is it's very interesting. There have been heads of state who have called for legalization of all drugs because they see that the damage being done to their societies by the current system is too great. So, it's not just here in California. It's also been in Mexico and in some South American countries. So it'll be very interesting to watch that trend.
I wanted to ask actually about the defensive education of our tastes in battling the food industry. I think that it's been difficult to implement a ban, let alone the legal issues. However, I have noticed that heightened awareness and increased sensation of taste has helped educate me a great deal about food, and noticing, being a huge fan of the corpus of your work from way back when through the present day, could you talk more about the connection between drug to food and medicinal diet in general?
Well, that's a big question, but just looking at the food issue, we are in big trouble with food in this country, and the only way that we're going to get out of it is if there's a collective effort to change things, and that means that the government, private sector, and individuals all have to take responsibility here. You cannot have the government telling us that we should eat better and at the same time ensuring that the cheapest calories out there are all the horrible stuff made with refined soybean oil and high fructose corn syrup, and it's cheap because the federal government artificially drives down the prices of those ingredients by subsidizing corn and soy, and there are no subsidies for fruits and vegetables, which are the most expensive things you find in stores and are full of health protective elements and are simply out of the reach of most people who are poor in this country, including people on Indian reservations and in inner cities. You cannot have these big food manufacturers go around freely making these products attractive to kids through advertising. So if we're serious about that, it's going to take changes in those areas. So I think it's a huge problem, and something that we're going to be forced to come to grips with, because the obesity epidemic and the type 2 diabetes epidemic coming right up behind it have the potential to just take us down as a society.
Thank you so very much for coming. In some of your writings, you've described the natural form of MDMA, and I can't remember what those herbs were, and that they were like a molecule off. And I'm wondering if you could expand
You know, I
on
don't
that
think
just
there is a natural form of MDMA. MDMA is a semi-synthetic compound, and it's made from, there are various starting materials that it can be made from. One is a compound called safrole, which is a natural constituent of sassafras root. MDMA has a peculiar chemical structure called a methylene dioxy bridge, which is a nightmare to synthesize. And so when chemists want to make a structure that the synthesis of which would be way too costly, time-consuming, you look in nature to try to find that structure, and then you build on it. I remember a synthetic chemist once telling me, he said, when you want a methylene dioxy bridge, you go to God. So, so these plants that contain starting materials that have that are really not psychoactive. So I don't know anything out there in the natural world or herbal world that I would call natural MDMA.
Andy, on behalf of all of us at Psychedelic Science, we appreciate you coming out and spending time with us today.
My pleasure.